Hi guys, welcome to lesson 2, all about fairy tales. So yesterday I loved hearing all of you retelling the story of the Princess and the Pea. So today we're going to be doing a little bit more work all about fairy tales. So you're going to need some paper and pencils just to jot some notes down, and then you're going to need the response button on the seesaw to show me your learning after this video. Let's get started. So your learning objective today is to explore the features of a fairy tale, and to be successful today you'll be able to answer these. I can find common language used in fairy tales. I know the general plot of most fairy tales. I know the themes of fairy tales, and I can name the characters that usually appear. So yesterday you retold the story of the Princess and the Pea, and hopefully you became really familiar with how fairy tales work. So today we're going to look at more of the features of fairy tales, and we're going to explore hopefully some of the well-known ones. So I did ask you to start to name some of the fairy tales that you already knew, so I've started to think of some here. Maybe you know these already. So we're going to start with some traditional fairy tales. And we've got things like, I'm sure you can guess this one, The Three Little Pigs. Can you name this one? Hansel and Gretel. What about this one? Cinderella. And what about this one? This one's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. What about this one? This one is Sleeping Beauty. I wonder if you can name this one. This one's Little Red Riding Hood. Okay. But actually some of the fairy tales have adapted and changed. Like I said last lesson, fairy tales are passed down through the ages and through time. And actually lots of fairy tales, the traditional fairy tales, have been adapted and changed. And that's what we're going to be working on this week. We're going to be working on twisted fairy tales. So here are some examples that you have definitely heard of. So one might be Shrek, where you've got a mixture of lots and lots of different fairy tales all in one movie, in one story. You've also got Frozen, which kind of follows the journey of two sisters, but it uses magic and things like that. And you've got Maleficent, which is an adaptation and a different point of view of the story, which we're going to talk about tomorrow. And you got the Huntsman as well. So, and then I found some other stories like Three Fish and the Hungry Shark. Okay, so and Goldilocks and the Three Pandas. So that started making me think about what is actually a fairy tale, and I had a little bit of a discussion with Mrs. Pemberton about this because I was finding lots of different fairy tales, and she's like, "That's not a fairy tale," and I was like, "Yes, it is." So I looked at what the meaning of a fairy tale was, and it said a children's story about magical beings and lands. So I was thinking, so actually, lots and lots of children's stories are all about magical beings and lands. So there must be hundreds and hundreds of fairy tales. So then we started to think, well, so what makes a fairy tale and not a fantasy or an adventure story or a fantasy adventure story? Because something like Harry Potter, I wouldn't say was a fairy tale. So the main point is that there is a moral to a fairy tale. There's a lesson to be learned. Okay, so and they're often children's stories. So I would say Harry Potter is a bit more grown up. So I've had a look in Essie's bedroom, and I've found some traditional state stories. So these are definitely fairy tales. So this is Cinderella, and I've got a different version of Beauty and the Beast. And I've found, when we went on holiday to Scotland, we bought her this book, which is Scottish Folk and Fairy Tales. Okay, and there's The Little Mermaid, okay, which is a fairy tale as well. And then there's obviously The Princess and the Pea, which we've been reading. Now I was wondering, maybe, do you think that something like Moana might be a fairy tale? Maybe it is a fairy tale, but based in in Montanui, where the story's based. And then we talked about just then about stories having a little bit of a difference these days, a bit of a twist on them. So I've found these ones. So we've got the fairy tale hairdresser and Aladdin, and the fairy tale hairdresser and the Little Mermaid, and the fairy tale hairdresser and Rapunzel. Now these are this is exactly what I mean by the stories have been adapted and changed. So now Kitty Lacey, this hairdresser, is now part of the story of Aladdin, the Little Mermaid, and she does a whole series of them. And then I've also got one of my favourite books, which I'm going to read to you on Thursday, which is Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Bogey? Okay, and we're going to read that one to you. And that is a bit like Shrek. It's a mixture of lots and lots of different fairy tales in one story. So in order for us to look at fairy tales in a little bit more depth, we're going to look at fairy tales in different categories. So the first thing we're going to look at is language. Now what I want you to do today is to look at all the different fairy tales. Have a think about maybe some of the movies that you've watched, some of the films, but also some of the stories that you've been read to probably all your lives. Think about what type of language are usually in fairy tales. So I had a little think, and I'm going to give you two very straightforward. So they often start with once upon a time, and at the end they often live happily ever after. But what I want you to do today is I want you to think about what other words can you find that are always used, or the type of language that's always used in fairy tales. Okay, so that's going to be on your first page on your task on Cecil. The second bit is the plot and the theme. So quite often fairy tales follow a very similar plot. So have a look at The Princess and the Pea and some other fairy tales. What is the usual plot of the story? So you might find some common things that always happen. So things like there's always a problem. I'm not going to say any more because I'll give it all away. So have a think, what is the usual plot? And then there's also a theme to them all. So in The Princess and the Pea, there's always royalty. There's royalty in there. So what other themes can you find that are always in fairy tales? The next thing is the characters. Now, there's lots of different types of characters, but there's often a hero, and there's often prince and princesses. But what other characters might there be? And I'd love to see some examples. So if you think about one of your favourite fairy tales, can you name some of the characters that would fit into maybe the hero or the prince and the princesses, or I can say the bad guy or the villain? Oh, I've just given you one. There. And then what moral or lesson could there be? So I would like you to do it in this way. Maybe you could name the fairy tale and then the moral or the lesson that somebody could learn from that story. So, for example, The Princess and the Pea, the moral or the lesson that you learn from it is the dangers of jumping to conclusions. Okay, so the king and the queen jumped to conclusions about the princess before they really got to know her. Okay, so you have everything you need today now to complete the task, but just in case you don't have a story at home, so you could do The Princess and the Pea, which I've read already, to do your task today, or Cinderella to put some examples in for each of the language, the plot, the theme and the moral, okay, and also the characters. But I'm going to read to you Cinderella as well, so that you've got two stories that you could think of for each one. So, and I like this because it's a bit of a pop-up book. So, once upon a time, a prince was throwing a grand party, a ball. He sent an invitation to every single house in the city, from the very richest to the very poorest. A girl named Cinderella lived there, with her two selfish stepsisters. "Can I come too?" Cinderella asked them. "Certainly not," shrieked her stepsisters. "You're too dirty and ragged to come with us." Poor Cinderella. Her selfish stepsisters. Her selfish stepsisters went to the ball without her. She sat down on the doorstep and sobbed. "Oh, I wish I could go to the ball." Just then something extraordinary happened. With a tinkle and a whoosh, As you can see why Essie loves this story, with all the flaps to look at. A fairy godmother appeared. "You shall go to the ball," she cried. "Let's see. First, I'll need you to help me find a pumpkin." So Cinderella took her to the pumpkin patch. There the fairy chose the biggest pumpkin, 2 white mice and a nice green toad, and turned them into a golden carriage with 2 white horses and a driver dressed all in green. "But I still can't go," said Cinderella sadly. "I have nothing to wear." The fairy waved her magic wand but the magic will Cinderella's rags were transformed. "Here are some glass slippers too," the fairy added. "But the magic will only last until midnight," warned the fairy godmother. Don't stay too late." The carriage took Cinderella all the way to the palace. It looked so pretty. Cinderella went inside. Wow, look at that palace. Everyone stared at Cinderella as Cinderella entered the room, and her stepsisters didn't even recognize her. The prince asked her to dance, and together they danced the night away. Suddenly, Cinderella heard the clock chime midnight. "I have to go," she cried, and ran down the palace steps. She was in such a hurry she left one of her glass slippers behind. The magic was starting to fade. Quickly, she hopped in the carriage and drove away. The prince rushed out of the palace after her and picked up the glass slipper. "Wait," he called, but the carriage had already gone. "I don't even know your name," he murmured sadly. "I will try this slipper on every girl's foot. Whoever it fits, I shall ask to marry me." The next day, the prince went through the city asking each girl to try on the slipper, but it didn't fit any of them. He came to the last, poorest house. Cinderella's stepsisters tried the slipper on, but they couldn't make it fit. "Does anyone else live here?" asked the prince. "No," said those stepsisters. "Yes," called Cinderella from inside. Of course, the glass slipper was a perfect fit for Cinderella. "Will you marry me?" asked the prince. "I will," said Cinderella, and they lived happily ever after. Okay, so that's 2 stories that you've got now to complete your task, but you can always do any fairy tale that you want, thinking of examples to complete the task today. I look forward to seeing your work later on Seesaw. Good luck!